Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the afternoon sessions. My name is Vanessa Lilly. I'm a second-year PhD student in Women's Studies and Feminist Research, and I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker for this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Greta Bauer, who's a professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics here at the University of Western Ontario. Her primary research interests are broader health of sexual and gender minority communities. So coming from an interdisciplinary background, her work has spanned the biological, behavior, and social, with a strong emphasis on quantitative research methods. For instance, she is interested in community-based epidemiology and methodologic and ethical issues in studying hidden populations. Currently, Greta is a principal investigator on the Trans Pulse Project, a community-based research project concerning the problems identified within Ontario trans communities regarding health, including physical, mental, social, and sexual, and access to health and social services. As a long-term ally, she is committed to improving the health of trans communities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Greta Bauer.
Hello, everyone. It is awesome to be here today on these lands and with all of you wonderful people to talk about some things that you probably expect might be a little bit boring, like epidemiology. But I'm going to talk not so much, I think most of the speakers today are talking about what we know about gender-based violence. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some things we could know about gender-based violence if we took a more feminist approach to how we actually organized and conducted data analysis. So I need to ask for a show of hands. Do I have any statistics nerds in the audience? One. Used to be. Okay. So this talk is not for you. But if you want to ask mathy questions, you can go ahead and ask mathy questions. For everybody else, there's only one long equation in the talk, and it's put there to look scary. So if you look at it and go, oh my God, that's why it's there. So I think we're all good then. So my own research where it's focused around violence, has been primarily around homophobic and transphobic violence. So with the Trans Pulse Project, which was the first big community-based health study of trans health, the first one to really collect quantitative data in all of Canada, that was just for Ontario, we were really interested in documenting the levels of violence that people in the community already knew they were experiencing, but we just didn't have those numbers to put to it. And so, based on our findings, 21% of trans people reported experiencing physical or sexual assault that they said was specifically because they were trans, and another additional 35% verbal harassment or threats, but not assault. So it's extraordinarily high. That wasn't a surprise to a lot of people in the community. And then what we were able to do is to start tying it to other kinds of health outcomes. And so we analyzed it as one of the different factors we looked at in identifying factors to reduce suicide risk within trans community. And it was one that potentially would have a large impact on suicide attempts amongst people who are considering suicide, if we could protect people from those levels of violence, from that violence. But we've had a lot of difficulty producing this kind of information, so I want to talk a bit about what some of the challenges are. And I think it's a really exciting time for analysis, not just of transphobic violence, but of gender-based violence more broadly, because right now several different things are happening regarding data collection, regarding measurement, and regarding statistical analysis methods that all come together in a way to allow us to produce information that's going to be a lot better than what we've had. So some of the data collection issues, most of what we've been dealing with are community studies, trans community studies, LGBT community studies. The trouble is if you're trying to see what's really driving an inequality between two groups, and you're studying individual variation within one of those groups, you may miss out. Imagine that you're studying something, and this happens in the US, right, with I'm going to draw on a health-related, not a violence-related thing, but with infant weight disparities between black and white mothers in the U.S., sometimes the tendency is to think, okay, let's study black mothers. But if something like racism is in fact playing a role in driving that, and you've got a group that's pretty much universally experiencing some level of racism, you might not actually be able to detect the factors that are really causing those inequalities by looking within a single group. So by choosing to look within trans community or within broader LGBT community, we're not necessarily able to identify the factors that are really driving these inequalities in violence, inequalities in self-harm as well. In addition, we haven't been able to do comparisons within large data sets, the kind that we spend a lot of public money collecting, because there haven't been measures that really measure sex and gender in ways that allow for any kind of complexity, including the identification of people who are trans or non-binary within those data sets. And so we're not really in a good position to be able to inform those, our understanding of those inequalities. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about measurement, and then we'll talk a little bit about data sources. I'm going to talk a little bit about stats, but again, it's all conceptual. So we'll all be good, right? So this is just a little tool that I created a few years ago to help researchers start thinking about how we measure sex and gender in research. Because the assumption's generally been that, we can have data in an administrative database or ask a survey question, are you male or female? And from that, we're going to assume that we know a lot of things about a person that we may not. And so these kind of cisnormative assumptions that assume that all these different dimensions of sex and gender are concordant within individuals and that that's consistent over the lifetime creates a situation where researchers are making assumptions that if somebody in their data set checks female, that they were a girl when they were young, that they're going to grow old as a woman, that if they're having anal sex, that they're the receptive partner, that they're the biological mother, to any of the egg person for any children that they have, which may not be true even for cisgender women, that they have a uterus, which again may not even be true for cisgender women. And so these cisnormative assumptions create for really bad research where we can't actually start to look at we can't look at inequalities, we can't start to look at some of the ways that different factors like violence impact health. So of the different, this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, just a kind of a starter set for people. And most of these, you'll notice, are things that are subject to change over the lifetime. Sex assigned at birth is an assignment that was made, chromosomal sex is fixed, but the rest of these are subject to potentially change over the life course. And importantly, they can all be measured. So we did a little analysis. There's a bunch of these now, different trans-inclusive measures of sex and gender. And I just put the paper here if you're interested in it. What's nice about this paper is that we did a mixed methods analysis with cognitive interviews of a maximum diversity sample of people in Canada. So we really get into some of the different issues in measuring sex and gender. So whether you like the final measures we came up with or not, the issues are really well described within that. And we ended up recommending that for health research, at least, that questions be asked on sex assigned at birth and on gender identity. And then for people who don't indicate male, male, or female, female, that additional question on the gender in which somebody lives their day-to-day life be asked. And that's important. Some of the measures that are coming out of the US are really just about identity. But when we start talking about violence, we sometimes focus really heavily on identity in research and not targetability, which is a different thing. Right? And it's different across all different domains, right? Somebody can move to Canada and not identify as black, but be racialized as black in a Canadian context, right? They can have people treat them differently because they're poor. They don't have to identify as poor for that to happen. So people are targeted in ways that are based on other people's perceptions, not their own identity. And so the gender in which somebody's living seemed to be very important to capture some aspects of that. And then for particular types of medical research, we may need to ask some more medical-related questions if we're looking at health impacts long term. So it's really exciting to be working on this and to see this implemented in Ontario Human Rights Commission surveys and other surveys. And also at that point, I started working with Statistics Canada when they had announced that they were going to be changing the census. And so for anybody who's following that, here's a tweet from Statistics Canada from the 16th of this month. And so they have announced that they have their new variables on sex and gender that are available to reflect Canadian diversity in this. And what they're doing for the big surveys, so the standard now is going to be gender. If they're collecting just one thing, it's going to be gender, not sex. And their understanding is that people will answer this question. The question is simply, what is your gender? And it gives kind of a loose definition, that they'll answer it based on their lived gender. I'm not so sure about that. We'll test that out at some point in another study and see how people's actual understanding is. But that will be the standard. And then for the larger surveys, they'll also ask sex assigned at birth, because then with those two pieces of information, you can classify people to identify people who are trans. And the gender item has another category that, I forget how they worded it, it might not be other, that people can write in. They're very comfortable with this because they have a lot of algorithms in humans to recode all those write-ins. And they feel pretty confident that they can figure out, where somebody should be within their classification. They're also just curious to see what the full range of identities is that people in Canada write in those blanks, and then they may create categories from those in the future. So what's nice about this is that we're going to finally have the opportunity with these very large data sets, some of them over 100,000 participants, to be able to look at inequalities. And for this audience, one of the things that's most exciting is that data collection, it was test run in a small data set just to make sure nobody skipped the questions. So people were concerned that cisgender, non-trans people would skip consider the questions redundant. That didn't happen. So it's now being used in the first large study that started data collection this month. And who knows what that is? The new gender-based violence study. I know. So for people are probably familiar with this, right? Status of Women Canada, Commission Statistics Canada is part of the gender focus that the government has right now to do this very large gender-based violence survey of 100,000 people in Canada. And it started data collection. It's actually on schedule. It was pulled together in less than a year, so that's really good for something of that magnitude. And so we're going to have opportunities. We're going to have opportunities for the very first time to actually look at trans and non-binary people and cisgender people, to be able to break things down intersectionally, hopefully, because we have a very large data set, right? And so if we want to look at gender by indigeneity, by all kinds of other things, we can look at those together within this data set because it's actually large enough to do that. So that's, I think, the excitement from a data end of things, that we're going to finally have a data set where we can look at these kind of factors. So the state of quantitative intersection, I mentioned intersectionality. So the rest of the time what I want to talk about is what can we do with this from an intersectional perspective, because I think that's where gender-based violence research also needs to go, is we look at violence against women versus violence against men. We have a lot of statistics broken down that way. We look at age. We look at all of these different axes singly, usually, and not in conjunction with each other. So what I want to share with you are some developments that are statistical, but again, I won't make it mathy, that I think are really exciting in terms of moving forward the kinds of information that we can produce. They create a few new challenges, but they're mostly challenges for being able to convey them clearly with such a large amount of data, which is a pretty good challenge to have. And so right now, my research team is doing a systematic review, and we're doing a review of all the English language research published across all disciplines. That's quantitative, where the authors say it's intersectional. And we're looking at the research methodology that those people are using. And our hope originally was to identify a lot of really good new methods that maybe could be adapted to health research from other fields. But we have an informal theme now of the systematic review, or Alma's smiling because she's working on it. The official theme of our project is, I was so excited to read that, and then I was so disappointed. So the methods are really simplistic, what people are doing. They're often just cross-tabulating. They're not doing a lot of really exciting things. The good news with that is that there's a lot of room for improvement. So of the quantitative papers, so intersectionality, I assume I don't really need to explain to this group, right? Coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, Black feminist legal scholar, the idea that power impacts people's experience in their life, social power, in ways that are structured around particular intersections of identity or social position and processes of marginalization. So intersectionality moved rapidly into qualitative research. For people who are doing qualitative research will know that. But the first 4 papers that were quantitative that really claimed to be using intersectionality were just in 2005. Yeah, the very first ones that we found. And so that's a little more recent than I expected, because our search actually went back to 1989. And the top fields, these are the fields of the journals it's published in, not necessarily authors: psychology, sociology, medicine, and women's studies. And those numbers are the number of academic papers that have been published in those disciplines. So it's not a huge volume of research, really, in terms of...
Quantitative?
Yeah, quantitative. Yes, just quantitative. Qualitative, that would be...
I was going to say, really?
No, quantitative intersectionality research. But then when you look at the quality of these, again, a lot of them are pretty simplistic. And so it's helpful, and it's great to see that people are trying to do, but they're kind of struggling with it. So a few years ago, I wrote a paper to try to push the field forward on incorporating intersectionality into population health research, just to identify the challenges in doing that, and also to outline the potential that this has, if we could actually do it and do it well. But also because what I saw was a really superficial application of intersectionality happening, one that was primarily just descriptive, that often actually didn't have consideration of social power in the interpretation or in the theoretical design, and one that was just really a very basic focus on population heterogeneity across sociodemographics and not much else. And that was disappointing. So what I wanted to do was to identify some methodological and theoretical challenges so that people who are doing quantitative research could say, here are some things that I need to grapple with as I'm engaging in this process of research. The first one is actually the quantitative theoretical language versus method. So in the intersectionality literature, right, Anne-Marie Hancock talks about multiplicativity and interactions, and that leads some statisticians to think that they need a multiplicative scale interaction, which is actually not a great approach. But the language is very, very similar and still creates confusion for people. The terminology we have about a mathematical scale that's additive or multiplicative versus these intersectional terms of additive as being non-intersectional, where we're assuming that person's experience is the sum of the parts, versus multiplicative meaning intersectional. Whether all intersections are of value for study. And I think this is a question that's really come out of qualitative research where, the interviews, it's so time intensive to dive really deeply into the detailed experiences. Quantitative research, because it's coming from a different perspective, where I was thinking of it like a painting, and qualitative research, you're looking at a small part of it, but you're looking at it, in lustrous color with a lot of depth. And in quantitative, you're getting this broader picture, but without that same amount of detail, right? And so one thing that quantitative research offers us is the opportunity to look across a large range of intersections, including ones that might not be prioritized. And I'll give you an example, is I've just done a little analysis looking at psychological distress across ethno-racial groups, bisexual, gender minority groups. So we know psychological distress differs by each of those. We don't usually look at those intersections. So the two groups that experience the highest levels of psychological distress just at the very start of that analysis are two intersections that are rarely studied: Indigenous sexual and gender minority people and Middle Eastern sexual and gender minority people. Not huge areas of research in those areas. So we have the potential to actually be able to kind of screen for inequality across a large number of intersections and to identify kind of problem areas. And then there's embodiment, and the fact that people can't be decomposed into parts. It's not like this part is your ethno-racial background, and here's your sexual orientation. Let's just cut you and reassemble you together. It's really clear in research. My colleague, Lisa Boleg's done some really good research. She has a paper called Black plus Lesbian plus Woman is not equal to Black lesbian woman, where she really documents that you can't ask people to attribute particular experiences to different parts of who they are. Nobody's cognitively capable of disembodying themselves in a way that allows them to do that. And the experiences of people have to look at them as whole humans, whole bodies in the context that they're in. So how do we do that in research? That means we can't ask some of these particular type of questions, but we can deal with some of these issues in analysis with different comparison groups. And then these are all statistical, the scale of our statistical models, structuring them to make effects visible and avoiding certain assumptions, like that all these factors are equidistant from an outcome or that data aren't multi-level data. So this was kind of the start down this road. Okay, hang on, this isn't the scary equation. So what I want to show you is just some of the challenges with older methods that we have. So statistically, let's say I just picked anything. So let's say we have 4 variables, whether somebody's trans or not, their sex assigned at birth, indigeneity, and immigration history or status, right? And we wanted to model these like in a regular regression model. This is not intersectional. This is just assuming that all of these effects, here's an outcome, choose any outcome we're interested in. And x1 to x4 are those 4 different variables. So this is assuming that you're just adding together these effects, right? So additive in an intersectional sense, actually additive in scale too, if it's ordinary least squares, but not intersectional, because the only way we get at the experience of somebody who's trans, who's indigenous, whatever, is by assuming that you can add together those components of them. Now, if we wanted to do a similar model using regression methods that allowed for each intersection to be associated with the outcome in its own way, here's the one that's supposed to scare you. This is what we're looking at. We have to look at each, the variables by themselves, each 2-way combination, each 3-way combination, and ultimately the 4th. Now, if we wanted to add a 5th factor, and look at a 5-way intersection, now we're adding 16 new variables to this model, 16 new terms. And then if we want to add a 6th, we're adding 32 more, and it's exponential. So it becomes really hard. Like, nobody has the sample size and the statistical power to be able to do this. And then you'd have to interpret it. Right? So one thing that's exciting is that this is how many variables would be in the model, not including the intercept, with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different identities, social position measures within that. And so, yeah, you can see. But so what I want to tell you about that's exciting is this thing. You're like, what's an MMMC model? It's a multiple membership, multiple classification model. And the really cool thing about it, the most important thing to know, is that if you want to add a new factor, instead of having to add 16 parameters to your model or 32 parameters to your model, you add 1. Which means that you can do this kind of analysis with a smaller data set. It's much more statistically efficient. So why is that the case? This is my non-mathy explanation. Oh, that's what they are, multiple membership. And this actually just came out in a paper last month, where Claire Evans has taken it. This method was developed in 2001, but really tried to explain how you would use this in intersectionality research. And basically the way it works is it's a multi-level model, for people who know what that means, except it's not really multi-level data. So we say multi-level data, we usually have individuals, for example, nested within the neighborhoods that we live in. And we might want to look at neighborhood factors, neighborhood rates of violence, fast food outlet density, walkability, neighborhood things. And then we want to look at some individual factors, and we're interested in how both of those impact an outcome. So these data aren't nested in that way. If you consider these different groups as second level data, it's not like these 3 people are all nested within transness and they're not within any of those, right? So this is multiple membership, multiple classification, and it's a new kind of multi-level model. It's not multi-level data, it's just data on individuals. But for those of you who are statsy, I will say one sentence: it partitions the variance across multiple levels, which is what makes it really statistically efficient. And so what's nice about this is we can take data sets like this new gender-based violence data set, and we're going to be able to look at 5-way intersections, look at people's educational level, by their ethno-racial background, by their gender, whether they're trans or not, whether they're living in poverty. And we're going to be able to put all that together. And what that means is that we can consider it kind of like mapping out inequalities across the population. And at present, we've only been able to do these really simplistic maps. This allows us to map in much, much finer detail. And so we can identify potential locations that are hotspots for inequalities where we might not be looking otherwise. The limitations are that it's still just primarily descriptive. It's about inequality and outcomes. It doesn't really get us toward the processes that are creating these. But it does allow us to actually identify where the problem areas are in a way that we haven't been able to date. So I'm super excited about that. And this is the second promising new method. This is my baby. See, under review, 2 periods, because it's been under review as of 11 o'clock last night. But the editor said he'd send it out for review, so I didn't say submitted. I'm like, no, it's might not be under review yet. So what I've been working on lately are these methods to kind of push quantitative research forward away from what I'm just calling descriptive intersectionality, this describing outcome inequalities in finer detail, and toward what I'm calling quantitative analytic intersectionality, which is really about looking at the processes that drive these inequalities. And because it's intersectional, that requires a few things. It requires conceptualization around power and the categorizations and in the interpretation. It also requires this focus on intersectional heterogeneity, that we're not going to assume that the experiences of people at particular intersections are the same as others. And now, while we've been doing that a bit, and we're going to do that better with outcomes, this also includes process. So some of you are saying, hey, there's a mediation model, and she's just picked gender-based violence and suicide risk because it could be anything. I'm telling you about the method. But you may be interested in if there's differences between groups at different intersections that you're studying in a particular outcome, what are the factors that drive that? So that's a question of mediation. And a little side point here, when we talk about mediation, we talk about this factor causing that. It's a causal model. I just want to say, when we say that intersectional group is a cause of something like gender-based violence, it's really different than it is in common language. We're not saying that people are responsible for their own treatment. What we're saying is a counterfactual definition of causation. If everything was the same other than some of those factors, would they have been targeted in the same way? Would they be treated differently? And this is the same kind of common logic that allows us to say things like, the police officer never would have responded that way, if the person was white or whatever, right? We're saying, except for that factor, we think that the action would be different. So that's what we're saying here. So we can look at these mediation models, but because it's intersectional, we can't assume that this process is the same for people at different intersections. So it's not just that the outcomes might be different, but the process might be different. So we can't assume that violence is going to have the same impact on suicidality for people at all intersections. It's coming in a different social context, with a different history. There are different susceptibilities or resiliencies in different communities, and we can't necessarily assume that process is going to be the same. So for any model like this, we need to assume in an intersectional sense that effect of that mediator on the outcome could be a different magnitude for people at different intersections, even in a different direction, or it may exist for people at some intersections and not for others. So that we can allow for that. But the coolest thing, and I'll end after this, but I need to explain this to you, is the coolest thing about this is that you can take this total effect, you control for confounding, you can try to isolate a causal effect, and you can decompose it into 3 components that have a really straightforward interpretation. And using my example, you could ignore the counterfactual equations if you'd like. I think they're pretty cool. It's the pure direct effect, the pure indirect effect, and the mediated interaction. So the pure direct effect is if it's significant, it would mean the intersectional groups. You're always comparing one to a reference group, and we choose the reference group with the lowest level of the mediator, like the lowest level of gender-based violence in my example, because that is a potentially achievable target. You can also model this to 0 for any mediator, but for a lot of things, we're not necessarily going to get to a population 0 level. But if we have 12 intersectional groups and we choose the one with the most advantageous level of that mediator, lowest violence, lowest discrimination, highest social support, whatever that might be that we're looking at, then it sets that as a potential intervention target for the other groups. So it's really asking, what if we equalized this across all of these intersectional groups? What would that effect be? And the pure direct effect is the effect that would be left after we equalized it. So if we took the groups who experienced more violence, we reduced it down to those lower levels, would there still be an inequality in that outcome? And then the remaining 2 decompose this indirect effect, that mediated effect, into 2 parts. The part that's due to unequal levels of the mediator and a part that's due to unequal effects of the mediator. So for gender-based violence, in this example, the pure indirect effect would look at what is the effect for somebody or a group at a particular intersection based on having higher levels of gender-based violence than at another intersection, at the reference intersection. And then the last part, the mediated interaction, actually looks at whether or not it has an unequal effect on the outcome at that intersection versus the reference. So it can really decompose to help us understand the different effects at different intersections, inequalities, and also to identify strategies. So for example, if you've got a pathway that's existing for a particular intersection and not for others, that can help you identify strategies for intervention, and that's the ultimate goal of it. Not perfect, and I won't go through all the limitations, but in terms of actually identifying strategies for intervention, I'm pretty excited about it. That's everything I have for
you. Okay, thank you very much. We have a few moments for questions for Dr. Bauer.
don't have a question, but that was really interesting.
Thank you.
Comments are also welcome.
I'll take comments. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you mentioned in your presentation that part of your research also goes into finding more problem areas and like in the country. So like, how would you define like a more problem area? Is it based on like how many people are like experiencing this thing versus like how many people are experiencing this thing in another area?
So by location, I don't mean geographic location. That was on my intersectional mapping of the population. So I mean at particular intersections.
Oh, okay. So it'd be like, so what would be an example?
So the example that I used was from this little analysis I've done that's just a two-way intersection with psychological distress, with the highest levels being amongst Middle Eastern sexual gender minority people and Indigenous sexual gender minority people. So that flags an issue there, right? And for those two groups, even if I was looking at day-to-day discrimination as a mediator, and the analysis suggests that even if we reduce that to the lowest levels of discrimination, that there would still be an inequality for people in those groups. And so that's intersectional location that people haven't really been looking at with regard to psychological distress or effects of discrimination. But what I was saying with this new method, if we can do these five-way intersections, so say in a year when we've got this gender-based violence data, and we can look at more complex intersections, who knows what we're going to find? That's what I'm saying. It's just something that's exploratory. It's kind of cool because we're not actually paying attention to intersectional locations in that amount of detail. And then the challenge becomes how to display the data. So that paper that I put up has like a 10-page table in the online appendix, because you've got all these five-way, there's a lot of different groups. And so I'm finishing up the first grant on incorporating intersectionality and multidimensionality into population health research methods and applying for a new one. If we get it, the new one will also involve some computer science people who will really focus on interactions with complex information, because I think that kind of information will be really well suited to an online interface where people could do their they could choose these different social identities or positions and cut it up their own way. To be able to, somebody wanted just women, for example, just cisgender women, and they could actually kind of produce versions of the data and explore it from different directions, so to speak. So we're going to have to do a little bit of work on that because nobody wants a 10-page table, right? I mean, I do, but.
I haven't looked at the questions that are going to be asked in the new data set. Is it all just related to health and victimization?
I was trying to get a copy. I was sick last week, so I didn't check if it was up. It was supposed to be up in April on the internet.
I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
Because then what I think would be interesting to do is to connect up some of the data that comes out of that with other data around health and criminalization, right? Because we're trying to do some other data sets, but it'd be interesting to see if there's any relationship between increased criminalization for these groups and if health factors are mediating or mitigating any of these factors.
Yeah. I know it's not just the questions on violence that are and victimization that are in there, but I'm not sure what made. I was at the starter consultation, but I haven't been part of that whole process. So I'm really curious to see what the final version looks like too. I've been waiting.
Yeah. Well, we can always link other data sets to it, right? To answer this question.
We can do all kinds of things. Yeah.
I read a lot of medical papers, and there seems still at this point to be a lot of medical professionals who are uncomfortable with gender dysphoria and find a way needs to want to explain it based on various factors. So, yourself as a medical specialist, when you interact with not a room like this one, but with other medical specialists, how is that changing or is that not changing?
I probably don't have an unbiased sample here because I'm leading a national study of clinics that are doing puberty suppression and hormone treatment for youth, and those are the most devoted, committed group of doctors that you'll see, right? So, in the work that we're doing, we're working with people who've actually made a decision and are usually putting in extra effort beyond what they're allotted in terms of their, there might be 0.1 full-time equivalent in terms of trans care, and they're all doing a lot of extra work and still with long waiting lists and trying to, dig out from under and not always being well supported. So those are the group that I would interact with most often. So they're not going to be representative of. I don't hear a lot of pushback from the medical establishment. I hear a lot more from the public, just broadly, than from doctors. Yeah, I actually don't see a lot of it in medicine. But all over the internet, as you know, all over the internet, you can find all kinds of stuff about, undocumented, non-existent things like rapid onset gender dysphoria, all of these things that are coming out of anti-trans pockets on the internet. Yeah. I'm not saying that all doctors are supportive. I'm just saying they're not necessarily, actively working against.
Public compliance, but not necessarily private compliance.
Yeah, or they haven't really challenged their own thinking around these things, but they're not actively resisting.
Okay, is there any more questions? Oh, go ahead.
Hi, Greta.
Hey.
Thanks for your talk. So I've done research from a qualitative standpoint on intimate partner violence, and something that has come up in the research I've conducted is how violence is constituted or even defined by participants. And so a question I have for you, or if I don't know if the research that you've conducted or will be conducting based upon the new Statistics Canada research, is how is it possible, or have you found the ways in which the questions are asked are able to capture how violence is considered by the interviewees? Because just as an example, I would ask women specifically about violence, and then they would say, I've never had a violent encounter in my same-sex relationship. But then later on, I would ask them questions, and then they would mention an encounter that they wouldn't necessarily consider a form of violence, but that other people may. And so I'm wondering, is it, in your research, have you found that how questions are asked may shape how violence is considered, and then is that translatable to different communities? So how have you noticed, or do you think it's possible to capture that some communities may have different definitions of violence, and that may be not necessarily the referent, the sort of an objective referent, if you will, or what some people maybe consider objective referent?
Yes, it's always a tricky measurement issue, and I know there's a talk this afternoon about how we measure violence. And I'm not sure what the new survey has in it at this point, which is why I was hoping I could kind of see it. But for violence, often we want to avoid questions that require those kind of attributions, because you don't want that kind of labeling or value judgment kind of process. So you always try to ask things that are more objective. Have you had this experience? Has somebody hit you? Have they done this? Have they done this? And try to get at those kind of concrete actions, so that we don't have to rely on whether somebody labels that as a particular thing. And I think that's especially true with sexual violence, too, where, if you ask people whether they've been sexually assaulted or whether they've been raped, you're going to get a much lower response than if you say, has someone ever done this to you? And you write out with the objective kind of description. And that's true across all kinds of violence. So I'm curious to see what's in the, because for something like this, I'm not going to go out and collect my own data set of 100,000 people.
Right.
And we're going to be stuck with what the government's decided to do. And so hopefully it's good. Yeah.
I'm actually going to be talking in quite a bit of detail about this. I'm
Okay.
Tom Johnson. I'm presenting it at
Yeah.
the day. So thank you for the segue.
Yeah. Just a little props to that.
How you measure things really matters, and how guest testing really matters too. So.
Yeah, that goes back to like the intersectional things too. In different groups, how you measure things matters a lot too, whether it's identity or it's targetability or some of these things as well. So many issues around measurement. Okay, I think we're at the end of our time.
Yes, we are. Thank you very much, Dr. Bauer.